Hey guys, tonight we are curling up in a quiet alpine valley to see how mountain villages survived avalanches, without heroics, and mostly without noise. This is a sleepy guide to small, steady arrangements, picking the right ground, planting protection forests, reading snow like pages in a book, and moving at the hour when the mountain is calm. We'll wander past roofs with modest snow guards, lanes that curve on purpose, and green belts that break a fast slide into tired pieces. We'll listen for the soft whomp underfoot. Watcher chalk 3 little words: watch, wait, go, and learn why doors sit higher, why paths keep to ribs, and why a full cellar is a kind of avalanche plan. Nothing dramatic here, just calm tools, patient timing, and neighborly rules that turned danger into chores. Make some tea, dim the lights, and let the Alps teach us the cozy, unexciting art of staying safe until spring. Avalanches are not surprises to people who watch mountains daily. They are habits. Long before anyone spoke of run-out angles and return periods, villagers learned to read a slope's biography. After a heavy winter, the mountain itself drew pale signatures where snow had torn past, lines of scoured turf, tongues of broken brush pointing downhill, a fan of pale stone at the foot of a gully. Those were not warnings pinned on a door. They were maps drawn by the hills. New houses did not go on those fans. Barns did not crouch beneath those tongues. The settlement shifted a few dozen paces sideways or a few meters higher onto a spur where wind thinned the snow and gravity had less appetite. Thus a village's outline grew lopsided on purpose, clinging to ribs and knolls that interrupted momentum. Forest was the oldest defense and the most beautiful. Spruce and larch were not only timber. They were breaks. Stands on the starting zones stitched snow to ground. Stands on the track broke moving slabs into tired clumps. Stands along the runout persuaded the last energy to lie down before it reached roofs. Communities protected these forests with rules that sounded like housekeeping. No felling above this line, no stripping of underbrush in that gully, replant after a storm's insult. A child learning to plant a sapling was told they were mending a wall. In a century, the wall would be tall and deep, and someone yet unborn would sleep easier for it. The ground itself offered vocabulary. Many valleys carried a pattern of old moraines, lumpy relics of ancient ice. Villagers chose to sit on these humps, not in the flat lanes between, because snow tends to straighten itself into a fast idea down the middle while skirting the knotted edges. Even within a hamlet, placement mattered by the span of a cart. A house's gable turned nose on to a known track narrowed the shoulder it offered to any wandering tongue of snow. A barn set half a story into the slope, with stone uphill and wood downhill, could shrug what it had to and breathe out the rest. Roofs became part of the terrain's wisdom. Too shallow, and they held the weight until timbers groaned. Too steep, and they sloughed snow carelessly into paths. The chosen pitch was a medium that knew both duties. Let small loads slide politely before they became large. Keep eaves clear of doorways. Drop snow into places swept daily, not into lanes needed at night. Eave boards and snow guards were placed like punctuation, keeping a sheet from leaving in one thought, breaking it into small, harmless meanings. Attic floors were tight so that warmth did not creep up and carve a thawed weakness under the roof snow. Heat lived downstairs, where people did. Stone was not just for churches. Lower walls and dry stone or thick masonry offered a kind of uncomplaining patience to slow, knee-high washes of wet snow that sometimes arrived after a mild spell. Upper stories were wood, lighter, springier, easier to repair when a drift misbehaved. Barn doors faced away from the track of a gully. Hayloft hatches were reachable from a safe side, so fodder could be fetched while the lee wall still shouldered a pile. Windows were few and small on the uphill side. Light belonged to summer. Winter preferred small apertures that could be argued shut in a minute. Between houses, lanes curved on purpose. A straight street can ask a moving mass to act like a river. A bending one steals its speed. Low terraces, hardly more than garden edges, served double duty. Neat for summer vegetables, cunning in winter, each terrace a lip that would stub the toe of a loose slide and encourage it to lie down. Dry stone walls, the same that kept goats honest, caught small snow tongues as if they were sheep. None of it looked like a fort. It looked like neighborliness turned outward to meet weather. Above the village, the human map thickened. Pastures were zoned by season not only for grass but for snow. Cattle and people visited high meadows early, before the mountain spring made snow heavy and ill-tempered. They returned lower when thaw could shake the slopes. Paths were braided. The summer footway might cut a gully clean across, but the winter way climbed a rib and stayed on ridges, stringing safe points together like beads. On doubtful slopes, Travel worked by etiquette. One person at a time over a loaded traverse, spacing like beads on a cord, the next foot only after the last sound had finished speaking. A staff tested not only the snow underfoot but the mood of the drift. Settled or hollow, bonded or sulking, signals stitched caution into community. A bell on the chapel could carry different sentences. One slow pattern for fire, another sparse for stay, a quicker, short-lived ring for all clear. A horn on the pasture above could be answered by a horn below, sound as a rope when mist made sight stingy. On days when storm laid a white lid across roofs, everyone practiced talk at the right volume, low inside, lower outside. Attention conserved for the slope above the roofline and for the draft that betrayed a cornice beginning to lean. Not all defences were old. Where a throat narrowed above a valuable cluster of roofs, villagers added low-earth berms and deflection wedges that turned a possible slide toward a gully that had always wanted it. In the run-out meadow, a line of stout fences on stocky posts, nothing fancy, just stubborn, caught shallow slips before they could build self-esteem. It was a grammar of interruptions, small barriers asking a big thing to become many small things. The mountain obliged more often than not, especially when trees helped, and always there was acceptance, which is different from surrender. Some plots stayed pasture forever because a house there would tempt fate. Some doors were positioned where a person could step out and look up the home slope first. Some barns kept a second exit dug to the downhill side, waist-high in snow, just in case a friendly drift chose to sleep against the usual door. People told stories about the year the ridge broke and the forest proved its worth, and about the foolish sheds that used to stand where the new bread oven now happily puffs. The stories were not to frighten children. They were to invite them into a long conversation that began before them and would continue after, about where to stand and where to lean and when to wait. By spring, the village's asymmetry looked natural, as if the mountain itself had arranged the houses in a scatter that pleased it. That was the compliment homeowners hoped for. Survival in avalanche country often meant being unremarkable, a house that never made news, a lane that curved without anyone remembering why, a church bell that rang only for weddings and ordinary Sundays. Quiet design earned quiet years. The mountain approved in the only way that mattered, by forgetting to test them. Villagers learned to treat a winter slope like a book with many thin pages. From the path you see only white, but under a boot sole the snowpack is a stack of stories laid down by different weathers, powder from a calm night, crust from a noon thaw, wind slab from a day when gusts carried grains like tiny suitcase travelers. An avalanche is less an attack than an edit, one page deciding to slide off another. The craft is to learn which pages get along and which remember an argument. The simplest tools were hands, poles, and patience. A shepherd crossing a lee slope might jab a staff and feel not a flaw but a layered paragraph, soft, then stiff, then a silence that meant crust, then soft again. That softness over hardness is where attention lengthened. On another day, the pole struck a slab that pretended to be stone. Slabs are winter's neat lies. Wind packs snow into a board that can carry a person, right up to the moment it decides to use its strength for leaving. The elders had no textbooks, but they had a vocabulary: hollow, drummy, grippy, sugary, sleepy. The words were not science in a laboratory sense. They were science in a kitchen sense, accurate enough to keep people fed and safe. Layer making where they wrote predictable characters into the pack. After a run of bright, brittle days, a strange frost sometimes formed on the surface, delicate feathers that looked like a celebration. Surface hoar, it's called, but nobody needed the term to know its manners. If new snow covered those feathers before the village had a warm day to erase them, the feathers hid as a weak plain, just where skis would glide best and where a whole hillside might decide to glide too. So people treated beautiful mornings with suspicion and took their steeper errands to forested aspects until rain or sun reset the page, wind wrote faster, and its handwriting was harsher. On ridges the wind sharpened snow into sastrugi, ribs like fish bones that told of scouring. Below, in the lee, it stacked slabs where nothing but gentle powder had lain the evening before. Villagers learned to read the rhyme: ribbed ridge, loaded lee. They set roots along windward shoulders where the pack was thinner, the way a careful reader skims the preface before committing to the book. After a real gale, even easy slopes were allowed a day to settle, and bells called shepherds to lower pastures for chores that didn't require crossing the mountain's new opinions. There were small tests, domestic as bread. A person could cut a column with a knife of wood, a thin board kept for the purpose, and tap it with mitten knuckles to ask where the layers argued. They could stamp gently with both feet, listening for the tired sigh called a whumph, the sound of a buried weakness collapsing and announcing, in a flat tone, what it might do on a larger face. A partner watched for hairline cracks that shot out like stray thoughts from a boot. None of this dramatized the day. Tests were like tasting soup. One sip, a nod, a small adjustment of salt or root, aspect and sun made their own schedule of caution. South faces in February flirted with thaw at noon and refroze to crust by evening. North faces hoarded cold and kept their weak layers whispering into March. East aspects woke early and were touchy in the morning. West aspects went heavy at day's end. The villagers' errands matched this clock. Firewood came from a shadier belt in the morning and from a sunnier belt late in the afternoon, so that people crossed slopes when they were least tempted to change their mood. A note by a kitchen door might read, in a hand that had written it each winter for decades, "Today, north late, south early. Wind last night." Cornices, those overhanging lips of wind-sculpted snow, were given the courtesy reserved for old, unpredictable relatives. Children were taught to walk on the windward side of the ridge where rock-anchored snow, never on the inviting white balcony. A staff was held out over emptiness before a boot followed it. On certain crests the village set a line of alder wands in autumn. When they showed as winter shrank, the sticks revealed the true edge and encouraged spring skiers not to invent a new one. Cornices were allowed to fail on their own schedule, preferably in the quiet of a high noon when slopes below were empty by design. Travel etiquette was a duplicate of river ice manners, adapted to steeper grammar. Parties spread out. One person crossed a suspect gully while the others waited under trees or on a rib. If a slope demanded a traverse, footsteps followed a ribbon where the snow felt continuous, never bunching at a convex rollover where slab likes to pry loose. Voices stayed low so ears could hear the pack's news, the tight chatter of grains under crust, the soft exhale of settling snow, the furtive click of ice crystals in a buried layer when a ski edge pressed. These sounds invite poetry. Villagers resisted and instead called them useful. Roofs got their own avalanche education, tidy and dull in the best way. A winter of careless heat would warm the undersnow from below, rot bonds, and drop a house-sized sheet at the worst hour. So chimneys were choked just enough, and attic hatches were kept closed as if modesty were a building code. Snow guards on the eaves looked like small fences in a row. They did the same work Alpine forest did on a slope, break the large into the small. On barns, the guards kept slabs from dumping onto feeders and making a slapstick of breakfast. Children shoveling paths learned to throw snow downhill from the house so their corridor didn't become a ramp that invited roofshed to visit the doorway. Warning came in modest signals. A flurried afternoon with quick drops in temperature could lock an early week layer under a shiny new one. A thaw that didn't quite melt the surface but made it weep told of a crust to be made overnight. Good for travel tomorrow at dawn, bad by lunch when the crust turned to loose pebbles on a plate. When 3 signs gathered, fresh wind slab on lee, a whumph on a small test, and shooting cracks on the first traverse, the day's answer became not today, and everybody behaved as if the mountain had posted a polite notice. Pride, which is so useful in harvest, is catastrophic in snow. Forest work was avalanche work done at summer speed. Shepherds thinned the understory just enough that snow settled through branches and found the ground, knitting a firm base. They left young trees where slides preferred to run, to become tomorrow's breaks. After a damaging winter, people replanted not randomly but in a staggered layout, like a checkerboard that forced any moving snow to split and weave, losing appetite. The village ledger that tracked pigs and seed also tracked protection belts, with notes as domestic as shopping lists. Larch row above Sana's barn, replace 3. Willow screens in the upper gully, tighten. Leave spruce shade on the east switchback. Even roads and paths had snow mines. The winter road aimed for ribs and broad backs, not for gullies. In cuttings, crews stacked brushwood fences, snow fences before iron and mesh were common, so that drifts formed where a plough could argue with them rather than where a cornice might adopt them. Where the track crossed a small fan of runout, a low earthen wedge, grassed over and humble, pushed any sleepy slough sideways into a shallow trench that had waited all year for this one job. Travellers noticed none of it until a late storm came home early and the village still felt ordinary. Rescue knowledge existed but preferred retirement. Long poles stored near the church could probe a debris pile if a small loose slide surprised a wood's path. Ropes and shovels lived beside them, and a board sled stood ready to be a stretcher. But the point of reading snow was to stay retired, to let tools grow dusty from lack of drama. People practiced with them anyway on dull Sundays, then went back to splitting kindling and stirring soup. When spring's high sun at last began to erase winter's arguments, the snowpack changed languages. Layers that had spent months pretending to be separate began to agree under the thaw's slow glue. Avalanches didn't stop. They changed shape, becoming heavy, Wet rolls that sounded like lazy thunder and happened at predictable times of day. Villagers moved chores to mornings, let afternoons be for mending, and shifted the sheep to benches where slides had already tired themselves out. By June, the meadow fans gleamed with pale rock again, the forest drinked, and the mountain's pages closed until autumn. The miracle in all of this is how boring it looks when it works. A lane bends, a house sits on a hump, a roof has small fences, a path keeps to the rib, a bell carries a plain message, a stand of spruce grows in a belt that happens to be beautiful. To live under avalanche slopes is to make these unshowy decisions until danger forgets your address. The mountain remains stern and sometimes loud, but the village hums on, counting winters by bread loaves and lambs, not by stories told with fast hands. If reading the snow is the village's grammar, then shaping the ground is its punctuation. Avalanches prefer a single, confident sentence: begin, gather, rush, arrive. Alpine people learned to break that sentence into calmer clauses. They did. It with modest earthwork, with fences that look like tidy laundry lines for snow, with low walls that lean like a shoulder, with galleries that turn a road into a brief tunnel, with mounds and wedges that persuade a moving sheet to split, tire, and lie down. None of it was theatrical. Most of it could be mistaken for gardening if you didn't know what you were seeing. The oldest tools were earth and stone. Just above a cluster of barns where a goalie's pale tongue ended, neighbors lifted a low berm, half. A man tall, 2 carts wide, grassed over so it belonged to the meadow. In summer it looked like a generous terrace for drying hay. In winter it became a word that meant not here. When a shallow slide came yawning down after a thaw and tried to fan across the flats, the berm turned its energy sideways into a ditch that had waited all year, and a morning's trouble became an afternoon's curiosity for children and dogs. Where a gully flared into the village green, masons stacked a dry stone wall with a thick belly and a kindly lean, not to stop the mountain, no wall is so proud, but to catch what could be caught and lower the rest into the ditch's patient mouth. Deflection wedges, 2 berms meeting like an open book, were used the way a shepherd uses a staff to part a flock at a gate. The idea was not to wrestle a slide to the ground, but to take its fast, simple mind and give it 2 thoughts at once. A moving mass that splits must argue with itself. Arguments slow feet. Villagers sided wedges where the track narrowed above a cherished yard or the church's lee wall, then planted them as if planting anything, a little each year, more when. A flood had been generous with gravel, always with grass so roots could finish what shovels began. A wedge is better when it looks like it grew there. Forests were the nicest interruption, and people improved their manners with fences where trees could not stand. Early snow fences were wood, stout posts in a stagger, cross slats with gaps that let wind spend its temper by dropping snow before it reached a drift-prone lane. Later, iron and wire nets took the work higher, into starting zones where slabs try to organize themselves. A line of nets across a slab's favorite birthplace is winter's version of tying a ribbon across a busy doorway. The crowd will still pass, but not all at once and not with the same appetite for speed. Nets need tending, their cables checked, anchors tightened, weak posts replaced before they sulk, and so tending them became a season of its own. On a still autumn day you could hear the quiet clink of tools high above the pasture where men and women moved from anchor to anchor, stitching the first snow to the hill before the first flake fell. Roads became pupils of these ideas. Where the winter track crossed beneath a well-known runout, carpenters and stonecutters raised short galleries, roofs on sturdy legs that let a small slide slip over the road like a tablecloth while the wagons. Or, later, the motor coach passed in a short, safe gloom. Galleries were not romantic to build, braces to set, water to manage so icicles didn't grow fangs, soot to scrub in spring. But they returned the road to ordinary, and ordinary is the currency of survival. Railway men learned the same lesson in a sterner key. Where the line needed to hold to a mountainside, wooden sheds with slanted backs crouched over the rails, not announcing heroism, only offering shelter to timetables. Catchments were a different species of politeness. A broad, shallow basin scooped into a fan below a gully can receive what the mountain sends on busy afternoons in March. It is a bowl in the big sense, but it works like a kitchen bowl. Hold, cool, separate, give back when ready. In summer, the catchment grew wildflowers and entertained bees. In winter, it entertained avalanche fragments and wore them out. Children sledded its rim when the schoolmaster's back was turned and learned, without any lecture at all, why the bowl was there. Every structure of interruption came with small, domestic responsibilities. Berms wanted grass, not bare soil, so sheep went here in spring and elsewhere in fall. Fencers wanted their lower boards cleared when wind stacked snow to their bellies. Otherwise, they turned into pretty screens with no work to do. Nets wanted their posts shored where Thor had given the ground a yawn. Galleries wanted their drip edges chipped so that a bright day in January didn't turn them into organ pipes. None of this was a great labour. All of it was a kind of tidying. That fit on a village chore list alongside sharpening scythes and turning the cheese. Placement mattered as much as craft. Elders could stand on the chapel steps and lay a finger along a slope and say, "Here the wind writes from west to east. Here the slab likes to be born. Here it rests before deciding. Here we will ask it to choose the left rib." They were not magicians. They were readers of habit. The wedge went not in front of a house. The mountain does not honour houses, but on the last, easiest rib before a slide would become a guest. The catchment went where a slide would already be tired enough to accept a seat. A fence went where wind's grammar piled language predictably. Winter travel adjusted to these arrangements the way a sentence adjusts to punctuation. A party crossing beneath a wedge did not bunch in its shadow. They spaced and listened, knowing the wedge was a helper but not a god. Teamsters passed through galleries without pausing to admire them, because pausing is poor manners under a roof meant to host something else. Children were told bluntly that berms are not sledding hills when the sky looks heavy and the temperature can't make up its mind. The polite thing about interruptions is to let them work without asking them to perform that on some hills the mountain answered with a test. A dry December ran into a snowy week, then a thaw, then a crust, then wind, then more snow, layers that argued loudly even to a glove hand. On such an afternoon a slab stepped off high, gained appetite in the track, then met the forest belt that had been planted when great-grandparents still used candles. It broke, as designed, into big loaves, then into chunks, then into handfuls of wet sugar. The wedge turned what remained, the catchment caught the sulk, and the meadow carried on being a field. People went outside afterward and played the old game of pointing to scours and deposits and telling the story back to the land as if it were a dog who liked to hear its own name. Then they checked posts, reset a slat, tamped a hoofprint where a cow had stepped foolishly into a soft ditch, and went in to stir soup. Not every village had money for hardware. That limited nothing essential. A line of willow hurdles, wicker, panels woven in autumn and set on sturdy stakes in January, could serve as a very honest snow fence on a shepherd's traverse. A couple of ditch spades and 4 pairs of boots could renew a small deflection lip in a morning. A sled could haul brush to a catchment's rim where drift had eaten the edge. The work scaled to the place. Pride scaled, too, in the right direction, down. Signals sat beside structures. After a storm, the bell might be rung not in alarm but as a reminder, 9 slow, the village's inspection peal. That meant, walk the wedges, check the fences, look at the nets, sweep the gallery's mouth, read the bowl. Children came along and were given little jobs that could be done with mittened hands. Tap this slat with the back of a knife. If it sings, the screw is tight. If it clacks, fetch the screwdriver. A boy who learned the difference between those two sounds had learned a kind of civics. Maintenance had a season of memory attached to it. Ledger notes were as plain as seed counts. Upper wedge, regrass south face, ditch clear to the alder, 1 post at fence 4 replaced, gallery drip good, bowl half full by March, empty with spring freshet. In the same breath, the page might carry a recipe for rye bread and a reminder about the school roof snow guards. To an outsider, the miscellany looked sloppy. To a villager, it looked like a life where each line supported the next. There was a humility clause that everyone understood. A wedge cannot argue with a crown fracture that runs the entire ridge. A fence cannot persuade a whole winter's grief to fall asleep. A gallery cannot keep a road if the mountain has decided to spend a morning teaching road's humility. On those rare days, nothing moved but voices on horns and the slow, low ring from the tower that meant, stay home, put on another log, send a message by the neighbour who lives on the safe side. Interruptions work in proportion to the scale of a season. When the season goes big, people go small and wait, spring repaid the tidy. Meltwater ran where ditches invited it, not across lanes. Grass took the berms into itself and stitched them tight. Fences stood like mild, dignified bones along a contour. Birds perched and sang their own opinions about wind. The catchment bowl turned bright with flowers before the meadow did. The gallery smelled of damp wood and iron and issued one last. Drip at noon before falling quiet until the first storm of the next year. Structures that had saved 100 ordinary days drew no attention at all, which is the praise they wanted. The mountain's temperament arrives at the village in small ways first, flakes thickening on hats, eaves growing whiskers, paths smoothing into a soft grammar of footsteps. Long before a slope releases a sentence in white, Roofs and lanes have been negotiating with winter for months. Here, survival looks like housekeeping. The angle of a rafter, the height of a threshold, the direction a door opens when the wind has opinions. If the forest and fences break the big things into small, the homes finish the work inside those small things. One board, one latch, one path at a time. Roofs were the first teachers. In avalanche places, they were pitched to a persuasion rather than a fashion, steep enough to shed before a burden grew insolent. Not so steep that snow avalanched off at noon into doorways where bread and boots must pass. The plank beneath the snow, boarded tight, kept attic heat from carving a warm mirror that would let the pack slip as one rude sentence. A little vent in the gable whisked damp away without inviting the stove's comfort up. If the winter was stingy with cold and generous with breath, families draped a woolen curtain across the stair to keep the hearth size from climbing. Roofs like this looked plain but wore the polite habit of shedding in chapters. A morning page slid, a noon page slid. An afternoon page slid, never the book at once. Snow guards did their quiet arithmetic along the eaves, small fences or iron combs set in rows. They were the household version of the spruce belt: break, stall, persuade. A barn's guards kept breakfast from turning slapstick by holding slabs until a hand had swept a safe lane under the eave. A house's guards kept the noon sun from dropping a single dramatic sheet across the doorstep. Children, who loved the theatre of a roof letting go, still learn to love the order more. Sweep first, then the guard releases, then you go to fetch pails. Winter paid back these small courtesies with uneventfulness, which is what a house truly wants in February. Doors were built as negotiations with drift and shock snow. The main threshold sat a handspan higher than summer common sense would choose. Latch straps wore leather so fingers could obey with mittens on. Hinges were mounted so doors opened inward in alleys likely to accept a sleepy drift, and outward in yards where snow lanes were kept religiously clean. Some houses kept a second, waist-high snow door on the downhill wall, a square that looked comic in summer and precious during a storm, when the usual door slept behind an honest barricade of white. Cellars often had their own exit. A cow in trouble or a keg needed in a night of weather could be reached without asking a stubborn Eve to hold a conversation with gravity. Windows faced seasons, not merely views. Uphill sides were modest, with shutters stout as small shields. Downhill walls held the larger eyes, because what fell from the roof fell away from them. During a cycle of thaw and freeze, shutters had a ritual, closed at dusk if the eaves were grumbling, cracked in morning to read the world, pinned open only after a broom had announced that the roof meant no mischief for the next hours. The glass kept its winter courtesy by refusing to hoard steam. A pan of ashes set nearby absorbed damp and gave it back later in the stove. Lanes, too, learned to be rooms. Summer streets that crave straightness let winter plead for curves. A path bent around the lee of a barn so that if a roof chose to sigh, its breath would miss the daily corridor by a cart's width. A low snow wall, just a windrow polished by hands and shovels, became a rail for attention even in night's white. In heavy weather, neighbours agreed to a one-sled street, and everyone kept to a gentle clockwise flow around the square. Less crossing, less confusion, fewer places where a runner could rap knuckles against a buried stone. Posts at corners wore small rings so a rope could be thrown fast across and make a polite gait that told a teamster, "Go slow." The snow is carrying other thoughts right now. Eves made friends with water long before it arrived. Gutters seldom survived Alpine winters. Instead, people trimmed drip edges like instruments. A strip of spruce bark wedged at the eave made icicles spend themselves politely away from doors. A trough in packed snow below led drips to a runnel, a narrow ditch that winter understood and spring adored. When a thaw turned to freeze without finishing its task, housewives tied a cloth under the eave and filled it with ashes. The slow black finger warmed the edge just enough to convince a stubborn lip to let go before night could turn it into a spear. The village rehearsed roof avalanches as it rehearsed fire. Not with fear, but with practice so dull it escaped pride. One person swept paths in a particular order that put the safe lanes under the eaves before any sun had a chance to flat a slate. Another tapped the snow guards with a broom handle, 2 dull thocks and a ring, to hear if the pins were still holding. In certain alleys, a small rack lived on a post that read helmets in nobody's handwriting, leather caps for the hour when a roof needed to clear its throat over a storeroom. Children wore them with fierce dignity and learned that safety rarely looks heroic. Even the church behaved like a house. The bell tower had a steep hat and an apron. The bell ringer kept a shovel by the stair and swept the hatch before each ring. Because bells and weather pulled small crowds into a corridor, you didn't want to clutter with surprise. The nave's roof, heavier than homes, hid strong purlins that told the snow to sit up straight. On storm nights, the sexton made his rounds with a lantern loaded low, flame trimmed to stingy, eyes on eve and path rather than on heaven. Animals deserved their own architecture. Barn entries faced away from avalanche paths and away from the line roofs preferred to shed along. Stable floors sat slightly sunken at the uphill wall so a low wash of wet snow would trouble boards less and find the door more by instinct. A cow hatch at the back, waist height, could be unbarred from inside and pushed free with a shoulder if the usual door had made a new friend named Drift. Loft ladders were hinged, not fixed, so hay could be lowered to cows even if the floor had learned a new geometry in a night of wait. Dogs slept with one ear politely lent to the village. On certain mornings they refused a lane and pulled toward another, and people, having survived long enough to accept instruction from sensible animals, went with them. Food found its avalanche manners. Ovens were placed where a roof could not throw its temper into the baker's path. Bread days shifted with the slope's appetite. Rise and bake when dawn promised brittle honesty. Stew and mend when noon practicing thaw. A storm loaf, thick crust, patience built in, was set aside for days when doors negotiated with snow and quiet was the best meal. Chimneys put on hats of stone so that shedding sheets cast their wet compliments at a respectful angle. Soot was scraped on still days to keep only one ash-coloured job in the alley at a time that iron heavy cycles. Neighbours set sleep paths, lanes that were always ready for night. They wound from each doorway to the same safe places: the well, the infirm widow's stoop, the barn with the generous loft, the house with the big pot. These paths were brushed as carefully as teeth. Lantern nails, short hooks hammered into jambs, held a candle or a horn light so a hand could find flame without hunting. You learned your path at 5 years old by mitten and memory, so that at 50 you could walk it with a knight's. Snow stroking your cap and feel only. Ordinary. When the mountain spoke loudly, when a slide broke high and far and arrived as a sigh against the forest edge. Houses. Listened to the air afterwards. A door was opened, then closed. Another door answered. Bells did not ring unless they should. Neighbours walked their lanes like librarians among shelves, checking for small things put out of place. A drift that had married an eave, a bench now a bulwark, a gutter turned spear. The grammar of roofs and doors had been honoured, and so the story ended dull. Dullness is a blessing that Alpine people acquire a taste for. The way they acquire a taste for cheese that smells like a cow's patient attentions. Children's games copied the villagers' skills until the children forgot they were skills. They built little towns in the yard with roof pitch right and alleys curved, then dropped handfuls of flour as snow and watched how it chose to travel. They learned to set pebble guards at the eaves of their toy barns so the flour fell in installments. And when a parent said, "Now watch the wind," they took the flour to the lee of a chair and saw how quickly a smooth plate formed there and how a tap could send it in one flat sigh across the table. The lesson was simple. Big behaviour can be arranged out of sight by small decisions. Spring measured the correctness of winter's arrangements with dripping honesty. A well-behaved village did not reek of rot. Its snowmelt ran where runnels had been, not through thresholds. Its roofs sloughed politely into piles that offered water to gardens rather than arguments to thresholds. The small wounds, an eave bruised, a fence post sulking, a shutter scarred by a clumsy sheet, were treated with regular kindness. A wedge replaced, a screw tightened, a board planed. A child rubbed tallow on a hinge and felt the hinge gratitude in the way a door could be opened with a finger. A village can plant forests and bend lanes, but winter also wants conversation. Snow speaks in small sounds and large, and people answer with their own modest instruments. Bells that refuse drama. Horns that carry a steady sentence along the ribs of a valley. Notice boards that look more like shopping lists than proclamations. Footprints traced at dawn by watchers who prefer to be forgotten by noon. None of this is heroics. It's housekeeping at the scale of a mountain. Attention arranged so that news arrives before excitement does. Signals began with familiarity rather than gadgets. Everyone knew the chapel bell's vocabulary. A slow, spaced ring for fire. A kind of walking alarm that gave even panic something decent to do. A thin, clipped pattern that meant stay where you are on storm days when the slopes above had turned sullen. A brief, neighbourly peal at dusk if a day of wind and heavy snow had passed without mischief. Permission to relax shoulders, to fetch water without glancing uphill between each step. No one argued with bells. They were the village's inside voice made audible outdoors. Up on the pasture ribs. Horns did a different job. Not the proud, long Alphorn of postcards, though those existed too, but plain valley horns and brass hunting horns with a winter dialect. 2 notes to say, "I see a roof shed." Not a slide. 3 to say, "Avoid the upper traverse." A rolling call to bless the work crew tightening nets above the gully. Sound behaves kindly in cold. It arcs along snow, bounces off spruce, and arrives softened, like advice. The person at the horn didn't posture. Often it was a shepherd, a woodcutter, or the schoolmaster taking a morning climb before lessons. They reported what the day had written, where wind laid slabs, where cornice lips looked thoughtful, where the forest belt had shrugged a small loaf and now lay peaceful again, watching had its roots and its manners. At first light, while roofs still wore the discipline of night and frost wrote clean margins around every object, a pair of walkers took the ridge path and the mid-slope traverse that tradition had assigned them. They were not inspectors as much as readers. Poles asked the crust a question here and there, tap, listen, move on. At a known rollover, they stamped with both feet and waited. No whumph, good. A soft settle, not today for that line. They did not test aggressively. They tested the way you taste soup, enough to learn, not enough to change the thing being tasted. Their footprints left a legible punctuation for others who might pass, commas at caution points, full stops where a short detour would be wise. The news came home on boards as humble as pantry doors. Outside the chapel or the cheesemaker's shed, a slate wore chalked lines under 3 headings: above, between, below. Under above, the watch crammed neat phrases: lee slab on west shoulder, avoid at noon. Cornice at older notch, do not trust the balcony. Wind quiet, new snow bonding well in spruce. Between held path advice and house scale caution, roof guards firm. Lanes brush first. Lower traverse one at a time. Below recorded the behavior of the runouts and meadows, catchment half full. Wedge clear. Bowl took a small loaf at 11. The writing wasn't officious, and it wasn't anonymous. A first name rested in the corner like a signature on a letter. Everyone read it the way they read the weather out the window before choosing a coat. The rhythm of warnings fit around chores. A horn after breakfast could send woodcutters to the east belt instead of the west, and thereby make the west safer by being empty at the hour it preferred drama. A bell at mid-morning might ask market stalls to set up nearer the chapel door so that the lane beneath the heavy eave could stay untempting. At noon, when sun rehearsed thaw on south slopes, the slate could sprout a new line. Postpone school sledding to tomorrow. Today the roofs mean to think. No one took offense. The mountain was the author. Villagers were the patient copy editors. Homes added their little signals to the chorus. A rag hung from a loft hatch told a neighbor watching from across the lane that a roof was preparing to shed and that the alley would be cleared in an hour. A broom stood bristles up by a door to mean path brushed, safe to pass under. A row of helmets on their peg meant we are shoveling below the eave. Mind your skull. These were private grammars that had become public language. Efficient because they saved voices for when voices were needed. Travel etiquette under watch was unexciting by design. Parties kept spacing on suspect traverses. A child crossed with a mitten hooked through a parent's belt rather than a hand, so that if a crust sulked, both bodies wouldn't negotiate with the same square foot of snow. On days, the watcher noted hollow talk under the first drift beyond the larch belt. The winter road moved up a rib without memo or meeting. Sled bells stayed silent where listening was more valuable than rhythm. If a horn called out a small caution, 2 notes carried from the dog spur, people didn't go see. They redirected and let the spur mind its business. Sometimes the signal was absence. A watcher who did not descend by the expected line did not scare the village. They waited 10 minutes, then 20, then went to the slate, which already told them where to start. Rescue was rarely dramatic. A shovel to release a door kissed by a polite roof shed. A hand to a foot whose ankle had found an old fence post under the drift. A warm cloth for fingers that had forgotten their arithmetic on the ridge. The same 2 notes on the horn, slower now, meant well enough. In a place that loves dull outcomes, this was the favorite music. Children grew into the watch through chores. At first they carried the chalk and wrote what an elder dictated, block letters on a cold board. Then they learned to listen, to tell the difference between a crust that pings and one that thunks, to notice a silent avalanche of roof snow in the lane across and add sweep here first to the between. By the time they were 12, they could take the lower route and return with useful sentences. By 16, they could borrow the horn if the schoolmaster had a cough. Their reward was rarely praise. It was being trusted with the key to the shed where the spare lantern chimneys were kept. There were rare days when signals asked for stillness instead of movement. A storm with wind from 2 directions, a thaw that stalled at a treacherous temperature, a ridge that had grown lips of snow fat and vein. Then the bell told the village to stay home. Stay sounded like a kindness when the fire had a sensible bed of coals. Doors opened for neighbors within rope distance. Beyond that, soup simmered and boots dried, and children discovered the civilization of board games. The watchers watched their own stoves. When the horn finally gave its rolling, relieved call at dusk, the village experienced that peculiar kind of happiness that involves nothing but permission to be ordinary again, signals attached to structures as naturally as ivy to stone. When crews tightened the ridge nets in autumn, they left a little wooden tag tied to each anchor with a red thread that washed out by February. A glance could tell a watcher which posts had been checked since the first big storm. At the gallery mouth, a notch carved in a timber, a new notch each year, counted winters without paper. The catchment bowl wore a pole with rings. When debris reached the second ring, the slate took the line bowl nearly satisfied. Avoid the meadow in afternoon thaws. No one needed a meeting. Hands simply turned chores toward what the ring suggested. Even animals learned the meaning of sound. Cows took the chapel's inspection peel as the cue for a patient morning. They shifted their weight and arranged their chewing accordingly. A stable dog, hearing two-horn notes lingering instead of eager, chose to lie in the door rather than ask for a walk on the lee path. Horses met the bell's stay by lowering their heads as if a quiet collective wisdom had been voted into law. When spring loosened the language of snow and avalanches changed from slab arguments to wet, lumbering lectures near noon, the signals changed too. The horn favored early messages, good now, not later. The bell rang less. The slate began to include garden advice next to the travel lines. Turn the runnel toward the onion bed. Watchers walked earlier, less for caution than for courtesy, checking wedges, greeting the forest belts as they found water again, noting which drips from the gallery roof needed a new path before they carved one across the road. The same attention, another dialect. By summer. The apparatus of warning looked like a museum of modesty, a slate that said nothing, a horn hanging under a shelf with the big ladles, a bell whose rope lay still like a sleeping cat, a ridge path bare where watchers' boots had made a polite habit out of the grass. Visitors would ask about avalanches and get stories that sounded half like recipes, half like mending instructions. That is how you know a place has survived a danger long enough to call it neighbor. It speaks of it in the grammar of chores that if a traveler asked an elder what the village owed its signals, the answer might be this: they buy us time to choose dullness. Time to change a route, to brush a lane, to fetch the right rope, to leave a loaf at the infirm widow's door before the thaw hour arrives, to agree on tomorrow without excitement. Bells and horns and boards do not command the mountain. They keep company with it until it forgets to be dramatic where we live. When mountains keep their temper, a village spends winter on chores that make good stories only to other villages. On rarer days, a slope finishes an argument and lays its conclusion in the runout. After the first silence, always longer than, it seems, comes the smallest necessary noise, a bell, not to summon drama, but to gather the tools that live for the day they hope won't come. Recovery is not bravery in the operatic sense. It is the same old household manners, taken outdoors and used at a different scale. Count, listen, space, measure, and keep your voice where the work can hear it. The first rule is to let the slope finish speaking. A fresh crown high above, jagged, toothy, means the mountain has changed its grammar. A watcher lifts a hand and points, then points again to a ridge where anchors, trees, or a rib offer a safe balcony. Helpers gather there first. No one runs. Onto the debris from below as if trying to catch an escaping guest. Loose blocks settle, tails of the slide keep shuffling, and the parent slope sometimes sends an afterthought. A count happens while boots stay still. Who is on the path? Who is home already? Who is surely not involved? Who may be? The list is written with names, not numbers, because names keep the work human and slow, two things that save lives. Lines are drawn across the debris the way a field is harvested. Tidy, parallel, overlapping just enough. Probes, long poles of wood or iron if wood is scarce, become the day's fingers. People stand an arm's length apart and work in rhythm. The way neighbors cut hay, plant, feel, lift, step, plant, feel, lift, step. The tip tells truth through gloves, soft snow, a log, a stone, a stubborn clump, a shape with a give that is not Earth's. When anyone's face changes, the line stops and the circle tightens. Shovels take their turn, but not with heroics. Digging is a craft. Make a trench downhill of the spot, step back and pass the snow like buckets of water. Keep the hole wide so the walls don't scold you later by falling in. Dogs join if they are part of the village's household and not a surprise invited for the day. A trained nose is a miracle of ordinary practice. The handler works a quiet grid just downwind. Nobody shouts at the dog. Nobody rushes to pet it when it sits. Sitting is a sentence, and the sentence means here. On days when the dog finds nothing, it still earns its supper. It has declared a piece of the mountain clear for today, and clarity is worth meat. On older hills where no one kept an avalanche dog, noses still arrived, less precise, more insistent. The winds, the watches, the villagers' inherited reading of where the run-out piled deeper and where it merely smeared. Time is not a clock but a stack of priorities. Air comes first. If a person is found close to the surface, the digging becomes gentle as bread making. Clear the mouth and chest. Keep the head downhill until breath returns to a rhythm that can be trusted. Warmth is second, but not the kind one fantasizes about by a stove. A coat opened under the rescued person makes a cradle. Another coat, a blanket, a door lifted from its hinges to become a sled. These are better than speed. Hot drinks are a medicine when they arrive, not a cure. Breath and patience do most of the work. A name spoken into a hat brim, then into the ear, keeps the day from becoming a blur to the person who woke up under sky and can't recall how they came back. The debris field itself is an education for the next 50 winters. Avalanches do not lay chaos, they sort. The top of the pile tells one story, the toe another, the flanks a third. Villagers read the shapes while they work, because learning while hands are busy is the only kind that sticks. Here, the spruce belt broke the slab like a loaf. There, the wedge turned the last of it. Here, the catchment bowl did its good, dull job. A line is added to the slate by evening. Wedge wants a handspan more height, or larch belt needs mending where the tongue rode high, or simply, today proved last autumn's fence in the upper start zone. Keep that crew fed. Rescuers wear their own safety like an extra layer. Spacing continues on the pile the way it did on the traverse. No one stands under a steep side where the debris has made its own little cliff. No one plants a shovel near the foot of a cornice. That lost its temper an hour ago and might still have something to say. Ropes appear, not to drag heroically, but to make gentle triangles. A rescuer at the lip, a body in the trench, a third person anchored to a sturdy root with the line paying out like a patient sentence. The dog, having spoken its piece, lies, where it can see everything and sleeps with one ear turning like a clock hand. If someone cannot be found by nose or probe, the lines continue until dusk and resume at dawn. Night between belongs to the village. Check on mothers and the old, stoke fires, send a boy with a slice of cheese and a word to any house that wears silence too much like a coat. The slate bears a sober, short note. Work resumes at first light, upper lines first, and no one edits it into drama. The chapel gives a late, low ring, not as alarm, but as a reminder to keep doors unlatched and lamps and candles where a waking hand expects them. There is an order even to grief, and it is kept by chores. A sled becomes a beer without changing its name. Doors open without questions and close without speeches. The runout, which yesterday was an anonymous meadow, becomes a room for a day and then goes back to being hayground in summer. The tools return to their pegs washed and dried, probes leaned like tall reeds, shovels scraped clean, ropes coiled in loose circles that won't teach themselves knots in the dark. The dog eats and then dreams, legs twitching, some younger. Version of the day replaying in a world where all endings are kind. Afterward, the village edits its map. Not with red flags and exclamation points, but with garden tools and small notes. A berm gains a hand of height. A fence gets 2 new posts where scouring took the old. A stand of spruce is replanted in the checkerboard the elders like, so that the next slide will never have the pleasure of being a single, speedy thought. The winter road, which flirted a little too close to the tongue, moves to the rib it should have preferred all along. A boy, watching, learns that the world is changed by inches and by afternoons, not by speeches. Stories are allowed, but only when they teach while sounding like recipes. We dug from a downhill side, like always. That keeps the snow from falling back into the chest. We stood the shovel on its blade and it sank to the hilt there. Next time we'll start our lines closer to the older clump. The dog sit was small today. Listen for the breath under the paw. These sentences add their weight to the ledger where rye flour measurements live and the note about mending the school roof snow guards. Visitors sometimes call this stoic. It is simpler than stoic. It is domestic. There is the work nobody sees. The quiet visit to the crown at safe distance after 3 days of calm to look at the weak layers like rings in a tree. The small ceremony of smoothing the trench that became a cradle and then tucking the smooth place under snow so spring. Won't read sorrow in it and grow flowers there by accident. The sending of a thank you loaf to the family whose barn door became a stretcher's plank at the right hour. Even thanks follows the rule of smallness, and there is the return to dullness, which is the villager's prize. The path under the eaves is swept, the bell returns to marking only the hour, the horn goes back to being a shepherd's punctuation. At dusk, the slate includes a line about turning the runnel toward the onion bed. The runout, now settled, becomes a playground again on late afternoons when the sky remembers blue. Children sled the rim of the catchment bowl and are told, without gallows humour, not the wedge while it's working, and not the fences when the wind thinks. They nod, the way children nod when the world makes sense. If an outsider asks what recovery means here, an elder might shrug and say, it means we make the mountain small again. Not smaller than it is, never that, but small in the ways people are good at: lines drawn, squares searched, names counted, dogs listened to, tea carried, tools dried, notes written, grass reseeded, and then, most important of all, quiet resumed. There is dignity in a village that survives by chores. Before steel nets and timber galleries, the Alps kept their own defences: belts of spruce, larch, fir, and beech arranged like polite crowds on the right ground. Villagers called them simply the woods, but they treated certain slopes as if they were masonry. Protection forests were not decorative. They were infrastructure that grew. They stitched snow to soil in the start zones, made moving slabs forget their confidence in the tracks, and encouraged the runout to lie down out of breath. The craft was old and patient. Choose where trees will do the most good, choose which trees can keep a promise, and then keep your promises to the trees. Placement came first. A belt above the start zone was worth 10 below it. Ridges with wandering cornices needed a row of stubborn trunks just back from the lip, where wind lost its appetite and slabs failed to grow coherent. Mid-slope tracks wanted checkerboards, not carpets. Staggered clumps that forced any sliding snow to weave, split, and continually make up its mind. On fans, a loose, thorny edge, alder, rowan, hazel, caught the small fragments and slowed the medium ones. The idea was to take a single fast sentence and turn it into 4 tired, short ones. Trees are excellent editors. Species were chosen by temperament. Spruce held snow in its thick arms and put roots down like a polite hand on a table. Larch kept its needles through wind season and shed them when heavy. Wet spring loads asked for a lighter crown. It bent instead of breaking and did not mind poor soils on ribs. Beech, lower and on warmer aspects, knitted slopes against wet slides and spring rot. Alder loved gullies and watercourses, fast growers whose woven roots taught banks to sit still in thaw. Rowan and hazel made useful hedges at the forest edge, quick to fill gaps where goats had been too ambitious. Willing to catch the first small loaf and pass it gently to ground, tending felt like gardening on a hill with consequences. Young trees weren't planted in ranks. They were spotted in drifts, 3 here, 5 there, never a straight line that might invite wind to make a game of it. Where a storm had torn a lane, replanting followed the storm's shape, not a planter's pride. Goats were kept out of young belts with willow hurdles and a shepherd's temper. Thinning was done with winter in mind. Take a few hungry stems so that those that remained were fat, deep-rooted, and boringly strong. Brush was left on contour as litter fences, small ribs that invited slope wash to drop its silt before it could starve roots. There were household rules that looked like myths and were actually science. Don't overclean the floor of the woods, elders said, meaning, leave deadwood sprawled where it lies, because it catches snow and soil the way a rough rug catches grit. Keep the skirts, they said of spruce and fir. Don't limb the lower branches too high. A skirt slows snow, hides deer, and shades the ground so frost can do its good knitting. Feed the feet, they said of young plantings. Mulch around a sapling with needles and a scatter of last year's cones. To keep spring wet from running off and to teach roots to look down, storm and beetle years asked for diplomacy. A brown patch in spruce was a wound and a temptation. Someone would always want the firewood. But protection belts were treated as commons with rules. Take the wind throne first. Leave the anchor trees that still hold the slope. Replant with a mix that discourages the next bug from setting a table. Where hot summers began to trouble low spruce, beech moved uphill by 1 terrace, and larch took a step sideways onto stonier ground. The ledger kept these quiet migrations next to pig tallies and rye measures. Upper belt, more larch in the gaps. Beech trial by the west rib. Winter's use of the forest was careful. Paths through belts were cut not straight but broken, 2 turns for every one, and never across a gully that the woods were trying to heal. Firewood cutting stayed to the edges and in summer. In winter, the belts were left to hold snow and learn the season's gossip in peace. Where a village track slipped into the trees to cross a lee pocket. Sled bells slept and poles tapped softly, because forest is a partner. And partners deserve the volume that lets them talk back. Every few winters, the mountain tested the green wall. A slab tore from a lee start zone, gathered speed on open ribs, met larch and spruce arranged the way an elder's finger had traced, and lost confidence. Trunks yielded and stood back up, crowns were combed, the moving mass broke to loaves, then to chunks, then to fist snow, then to size. The run-out bowl accepted the tired remainder, and by lamplight a line went on the slate. Upper belt answered well. Replace 4, brace 2. The next autumn, children helped carry saplings in baskets. A larch fit into a hole like a spoon into a jar. A muddy thumb pressed the soil down. A child learned that buildings aren't the only walls. Rockfall was the cousin problem the forest quietly managed. In dry spells and early thaws, stones practiced mischief. Protection belts took the sting out of their practice. Branches snagged tumbling shapes, trunks shouldered them aside, duff swallowed the last roll. Thorny hedges at the forest skirt turned small rocks into smaller irritations long before they could audition for drama down by the lane. Villagers noticed rocks when they were missing, when a goat broke a hedge or a woodcutter stripped a slope too clean. The next week, hurdles went up, saplings went in, and the world remembered how to behave. Law and custom shook hands over protection forests. Some hills wrote down what others kept as habit. Schutzwald, protection wood, marked by the parish seal on a map and by a boy's feet, told to keep out the goats. Felling needed permission and replanting got praise. On years when money was thin and timber prices were immodest, the bell still rang the inspection peal after a wind event, not because it was dramatic, but because temptation is a weather of its own. A walk through belts with pole and pencil reminded everyone that a quick coin can cost a slow century. Protection trees grew into the village story the way rafters grow into a roof. Names attached themselves. The old shoulders, 2 larches that bent and survived. The stitch, a zigzag of spruce across a shallow scar. The comb, a row of firs that tamed a troublesome gully. Children climbed their lowest branches in summer and, in winter, were kept to paths that respected the roots. When a storm laid one of the famous down, neighbours cut seats from the butt and placed them where old knees liked to sit in sun. Nothing left the hill without leaving something that kept work company. Forest work had seasons that dovetailed with hay and cheese. Planting on thawed days after snow melt. Fence mending before goats went to their high manners. Thinning in the cool after grain was in. Brush laying just ahead of the first real snow so it would catch and hold without having to be asked twice. The work looked like tidying because it was. The payoff, no news, arrived all winter long. In late winter, when slabs went wet and slow and the belts wore coats of glazed sugar, the forest still worked. Branches bent and didn't bother to crack. Roots gripped thawing skin and kept the slope wearing its own face. In April, meltwater threaded itself into last year's duff and learned again that the proper place for water is in the ground, not in the lane. A boy with a stick followed a rivulet, poked a leaf dam, and by accident did exactly what his grandparents did with shovels and hedges, taught water a route that made friends instead of problems, visitors, charmed by the dark bands against the white, sometimes called the belts beautiful. Villagers agreed and then went on with the chores that keep beauty useful. Keep goats out, plant in the gaps, leave the skirts. Feed the feet, lay the brush, mend the hurdle, sign the ledger. Forests are patient machines that turn attention into safety. The Alps had them before villages had words like infrastructure. The words came later. The attention was always their .by summer. The belts hummed with neat, unheroic business. Birds, bees, resin warming in sun, shade on the cattle track, a place to step off the road and drink from the cool. In autumn, the belts took wind on behalf of roofs. In winter, they turned avalanches into chores. In spring, they held wet snow until it learned to be water again. A green wall is a humble thing and a brilliant one. Villages that remember to grow their own walls can forget to tell stories about avalanches, which is exactly the point. Cornices are winter's theatre balconies, built by wind for an audience of cliffs and bowls. From below, they look like frozen waves. From above, like extra ground, treacherously ordinary until the day they forget to be attached. Alpine villagers learn to treat cornices like temperamental elders, with courtesy, with distance, and with arrangements made in advance so nobody needed to raise their voice later. The art is simple to describe and long to learn. Know where they grow. See them before they pretend to be the horizon. Never step onto the balcony to see the view. And let them fail on their schedule, not yours. Wind is the carpenter. A prevailing gale crosses a ridge. pluck snow from the windward side where the pack thins, and lays it on the lee like boards laid proud of their joists. With time and repeating squalls, the balcony creeps outward, bonded poorly near its overhanging lip and sometimes weakly where warm breath has visited from below. The same ridge can wear different hats in one winter, slim and neat after a cold dry spell, fat and self-satisfied after a week of storm and brief thaws. Watchers learned each ridge biography, where the wind finds a notch, where it curls, where the cornice favours a sneaky overhang farther back than naive boots would guess, seeing is half the defence. Villagers planted alder wands in late autumn along certain crests, spaced at arm lengths, set just back from the summer edge. In January, a wand that seemed too far in was exactly right. It reminded a traveller that the true ground lived under the wand, not under the handsome white shelf 2 paces beyond. After storms, the first job was to read the crest from safe angles, up through trees to see the underbelly shadows, along a shoulder where rock showed honest. From the far valley with a spyglass the schoolmaster kept near his chalk. The slate outside the chapel would then get its short line, alder notch, balcony fat. Walk windward. No edges. Walking ridges had a grammar, conservative even on honest days. You stayed on rock when rock showed, even if it made your ankles think in odd angles. You kept skis uncrossed, poles ready to test the lip without becoming anchors. When a section looked too tidy to be real, you unhooked the strap from your pole hand. No one wants to be tied to a disappearing sentence, and you reached out to tap air, not snow. A hollow, fluted sound meant balcony. A dull, rooted sound meant ground. On narrow crests, parties moved one at a time. The others waited on windward humps where the world was bored and therefore safe. Dogs went leashed. Even the best nose can be seduced by a drift that smells like new country. Cutting cornices, encouraging them to fail while you watched from respect, was a village chore with more rules than glory. It was done on certain ridges above open fans that ended far from roofs and roads, on blue mornings after a jealous week of wind. 2 people, ropes short, worked from far back with shovels, not with theatrical leaps. They undercut the lip until a line drew itself, then retreated to windward rock and tugged a cord laid across the cut. The piece went politely, and the ridge sighed, and the fan below learned its first lesson of the season in daylight. The horn sent 2 slow notes down valley, balcony down. Children were kept off those fans for the day. Because even polite work throws a few impolite afterthoughts, ridges guide routes in winter as sternly as rivers guide boats. The winterway chose crests for 2 reasons. The pack is thinner where the wind skims, and the view down both flanks lets you hear the mountain's mood. But crests are honest only if you honour their edges. When a lee bowl wore feathered snow that invited turns, skiers treated it like a room behind a curtain, entered at the safest door, not by pushing through the cloth. When a cornice overhung a gully that reeked of wind slab, the route weighed an extra hour on the windward talus against an extra 5 minutes on the calendar at the undertaker's. The math always came out the same. Sun, too, writes its lines on cornices. A cold spell builds proud, crystalline shelves that break like glass. A run of high suns rounds them, warms their underjoints, and loads them with vanity. Noon is the hour of treachery on a warm day. Villagers timed their ridge business for dawn, frost like starch in a collar, and for late afternoon when the temperature slid back toward discipline. If a thaw ran for days, the bell suggested a general humility. Stay on the ribs in the forest. Leave the balcony to its tantrums. Meanwhile, roofs practiced their own cornice etiquette, snow guards talking in a domestic key what ridges shouted outdoors, stories about foolishness gathered around cornices and were retold with a pointed gentleness. The year the schoolboy jumped the lip to make his mark and landed in the bowl. Fine lungs, bad judgment. Learned to prefer signatures on slates. The hunter who stalked a chamois to the balcony and discovered chamois prefer to live. He learned to prefer windward. Rock. The visiting skier who stepped onto the white. Horizon for a photograph, saved by his friends. Fast rope and slower lecture. Such stories bent pride into knowledge and made comedy out of luck so that luck would not be mistaken for. Skill tools had corner settings. A pole with a short, stout basket and a heavy tip told more truth than a race stick. A small hand saw road in a watcher's pack, to cut a clean weakness rather than tear an ugly one that wandered. A strip of bright cloth on the windward side of a crest made the path legible in ground fog. Ropes were short on ridges. Long lines do mischief in wind and on narrow ground. Knots were simple and familiar. No one wanted to invent cleverness with cold hands on a day the mountain felt witty. Forest belts near ridges made a difference even here. A tight stand tucked just under a crest-caught windsnow before it could learn arrogance. Larch and spruce, planted a lifetime ago, rose into their job without speeches, their lower branches combing down spindrift that would otherwise join the balcony. Where ridges were bare by nature, high, rocky, proud, nets and posts in the start zones below replaced the tree's courtesy. Villagers treated both, trees and nets, as versions of the same grammar: interrupt, split, tire, quiet when a cornice failed on its own terms, and they do. From thunder, from sun, from their own weight, watchers read the debris the way river people read spring ice. Big blocks meant a crisp, cold fracture. Flour and loaves meant warmth had eaten joints. Long overreach meant wind had built the shelf farther back than last week's boots believed. The slate grew a line that afternoon. Long reach at old notch, keep 2 steps inland until next storm. In the schoolhouse, the master sketched a ridge on the board, drew the safe path in dull chalk, the lip in bright, and let children copy it onto their slates until the lines lived in wrists as much as in eyes. Night held its own rules. Moon makes cornices deceptive. Silver turns the balcony into a continuation of earth, and shadow hides the undercut. Lanterns are worse. They throw lies onto the lip. So ridges at night were travelled only when necessary. A birth, an illness, a letter that could not wait, a search. Then the rope was almost a ribbon, short, felt more than seen. Boots chose rock. The pole tapped air, not margin. The mountain, hearing manners, often found its OWN.BY spring. Cornices reveal their carpentry. The layered cross-sections stand in the sun like pastry. Storm, wind, thaw, wind again, until the day the whole cake leans and slumps in slow motion. Villagers mark those days by doing something else in the valleys. Children are taken to see the ruins later, taught to count the layers with a mittened finger, then told the line that every child learns by heart: the balcony is not a floor. It becomes a proverb for other parts of life, which is a mountain's favorite kind of victory. Maintenance is mostly memory. Replace the older wands that vanished under a proud lip. Check the knot on the ridge net's last post. Walk the windward stones and kick loose plates off so they won't skate under a new storm. Tell the slate what you saw in a sentence short enough to be read with cold hands. The work is small, which is the point. Big gestures on ridges generally end in big stories, and villagers prefer small stories with warm endings. If a stranger, standing on a spring day with blue in all directions, asks why the path wanders so far inland along a tame-looking crest, an elder may answer, because we are saving the surprise for the mountain, not for us. Cornices are weather-wearing sculpture. Sculptures demand distance, not because they are holy, but because they are heavy and attached in ways a boot cannot audit. Walk the windward rock. Let the balcony fail when it is ready. Arrive at supper on time. Some problems are best persuaded to happen at a time of your choosing. Avalanches belong to that category. Long before modern gear, villagers cut cornices or let a loud noon thaw sweep a fan that nobody stood beneath. Later, when roads and rails insisted on timetables, control work became a craft with its own grammar, less romance than routine. The point was not to pick fights with mountains. It was to invite the inevitable on a quiet morning while ropes were strung, roads were empty, the horn had warned the valley, and a ledger waited with squares to tick. The day began on paper. A weather book sat beside coffee. Wind directions and speeds, new snow, temperatures at dawn, noon, dusk, and the irritable hours between. A run list lay under a brass clip. Start zones numbered like cupboards, their habits summarized in pencil: 2A crossloads in norths, 2B spindrift fills after southerlies, 3 ridge cornice long reach. Beside each name, a modest plan: cut, hand charge, gas exploder, or leave well enough alone and close the road. Decisions were short sentences with long memories. The same slope had been read each winter for decades, and the notes accumulated like patient dust. Closures came first, because permission to be dull is the best tool. Barriers at the road mouth swung across with a wooden clack. Lights flipped from sleepy amber to red. A bell at the chapel marked the change with a low pattern everyone recognized. Stay, please. We are putting the dishes away before the cat explores. A horn on the ridge spoke back, not because echo was pretty, but because sound travels where people should not. In kitchens, a ladle was set down and kept warm. Boots waited 10 minutes longer to leave their pegs. A village that practices patience can buy it cheap when it is dear. The oldest control remained the simplest: walk a ridge and make the balcony fail politely. 2 workers roped short, an anchor stone rapped twice, shovels and a handsaw, a cord laid behind the cut, a tug from safe rock. The slab went with a sigh, not a speech. The fan below received it with the bored grace of a field that had been asked the same favour every January. Notes were made: alder notch swept at 9, crown shallow, run short, reopen lower road at 10. Children heard the horn slow. Relieved call and knew the fan was no playground until tomorrow. Hand charges came only where the alphabet of slopes demanded them and only by people who had practiced until the drama went out of the work. Charges rode in a wooden box with padded holes, fuses counted twice, caps counted thrice, hands kept warm enough to be honest. A start zone was approached from a rib a grandmother would approve of. A cornice lip was never asked to hold a human while a fuse hissed. A toss was a tidy arc to a place already chosen with a pole and a line of sight to rock. The fuse burned. For a number of slow breaths everyone could recite. The party crouched where a child could describe their shelter. The sound, more thud than bang and snow, arrived. The slab considered the invitation and usually accepted. If it didn't, nobody negotiated with cleverness. They left a note for the next window and went to the next cupboard on the list. Gas exploders turned wind into work. Heavy steel horns, upside-down chimneys, sat bolted to posts in sly start zones. On the right day a small can of fuel and oxygen was mixed and sparked inside the horn, and a fat bubble of pressure rolled into the snowpack like a hand pressing a piano key. In good conditions the slope answered with a shrug that became a slide. The crew didn't admire the machine afterward. They wiped the rim of rime so the next spark wouldn't sulk, noted Gazex 4-fired twice, second produced slab, run to midbelt, and walked on. Machines are servants. They appreciate being treated like brooms. Towers, lean lattices with messenger lines, did their work with a villager's sense of scale. A small charge slid down a wire to a shelf that knew where to aim. Then the wire sang a little when the slope answered. A red flag on the tower arm told watchers below which shelf was last used. A chalk mark on the slate told travellers when the window would open. The polite part was not the blast. It was the road steward at the barrier, explaining with the patience of a baker about ovens. 15 more minutes to be sure. We want the run out to finish its sentence. People smiled and saved their tempers for summer, when tempers give better sport. Helicopters were the visiting cousins, useful, loud, expensive, and therefore invited only when big weather had rearranged the furniture and a week's work must be done in a day. Pilot and blaster read the same book as the ridgewalkers. They just turned the pages faster from a safe distance. In the village, the horn spoke in a different key and dogs hid under tables. A road remained closed a little longer after rotor wash had bullied an edge. Wind tricks lingered, and villagers preferred certainty over schedule. When the thump-thump faded, the valley took a breath and remembered tea. Railways had their own grammar. Snow sheds crouched over the line like polite beasts. Tunnels swallowed timetables and returned them intact. Control crews swept the sheds' backs with charges placed like commas. Never too long between, never too short to waste time. Plows waited where plows could wait. Locomotives showed their modest, clever plows with the self-esteem of tools that know their worth. A green flag remained grey until a watcher's pencil wrote shed 3 clear. Ridge above quiet. Proceed at walking speed to the bridge. Control work carried its own housekeeping. Radios lived on chests but spoke with inside voices. Checklists wore grease pencil and mittens. Fuses counted. Caps returned. Road signed. Horn answered. Slate written. A forgotten step made more work later, like flour left unbagged for mice. The best days were the ones where the last square was ticked and the crew came home early enough to fix a fence and finish the soup. People tell stories about artillery that used to bark in some valleys. The village liked the eras with fewer bangs and more notes. Not every slope accepted a morning invitation. Some chose to wait and be dramatic at 2 in the afternoon, when sun and vanity got together. Those days were what closures are for. A barrier that turns away a wagon, a tourist car, a boy on a bicycle. In March is a better structure than any gallery, and galleries are fine structures. Elders told the young that closed is an act of generosity, not scold. It gives the mountain a chance to speak with nobody under its breath. After an operation, the work turned into the familiar quiet chores that make a place safe. Crowns were walked from above on the next still day, not to admire but to read. Layers like pastry, blocks like books, the kind of fracture that tells next week's plan. Nets were inspected, posts tightened, deflecting wedges tighted where the run had broken their green crust. The catchment bowl was let alone until night, when cold would make its edges honest again. The slate recorded the day as if it were market. 2A, 2B, 3 treated, run out short, road open by 10, no secondary action. Dullness is a prize. It deserves ink. The village learned the schedule of these UN spectacles. On certain storm sequences, people expected the morning horn. Bread came out of ovens an hour earlier. School books were stacked for an afternoon. Lesson: the milk run went on the forest road instead of the gallery road because patience is less brittle under trees. A child would ask, "Exploders today?" and be told, "Likely," and the child would nod, not because machines are thrilling, but because calendars are comforting. Control had limits that were treated as laws. Start zones above houses might be touched with a charge only when the wind said no to mischief. Fans that kissed a barn were left to sun and cold, not to explosives, because luck is a poor colleague. In places of tight consequence, the best control was prevention you could grow, protection forests, fences, and the habit of choosing routes the way you choose words when you're tired, plain ones that don't invite confusion. Visitors sometimes asked whether the mountain liked being bombed. Elders shrugged the question off like snow from a hat brim. The mountain doesn't like or dislike. It simply answers what it is asked, and the village tries to ask sensible questions at sensible hours. A slope that slides at 9 in front of 2 careful witnesses is a slope that would have slid at noon while a truck passed under it. The difference is attention. Attention, like gravity, is a force that can be harnessed. By spring, control work turned to observation. Wet slides don't answer charges as clearly. They answer heat and clocks. Closures arrived later in the morning, opened earlier in the evening, and the horn spoke less. The ledger took more garden notes than gas notes. Nets rested, towers looked out over green that did not mind them, and the village practiced the other form of avalanche control, leaving the mountain alone because it was busy turning into water. If you boil all of this routine into one sentence, it is this: make the big thing happen when little things are ready. Barriers, boards, bells, horns, ropes, rosters, and patient breakfasts are the little things. The big thing is a slab that wanted to right itself anyway. Villages that keep their checklists neat get their roads back by 10 and their children home by noon. And the mountain, having been allowed to be large at a convenient hour, goes back to being scenery while soup is served. Winter loosens its grip not with trumpets but with dripping. The same slopes that spent months speaking in crisp, slabby syllables change to a wetter language, lazy rolls, slow tears, soft arguments that begin at noon and end at dusk. Villagers survive spring not by pretending it was still January, but by shifting to melt-time manners, earlier hours, shadier lines, wider patience, and a housekeeping campaign to give water a home that wasn't a lane. Wet snow has its own signatures. Rollerballs, little snow wheels, start to tumble under the first warm sun and leave pearl tails down short faces. Pinwheels grow into small fans, then into loose slides that gather heft as they comb the hill. A crust that carried a person at dawn becomes custard by lunch. A pole that rang all winter begins to thud. Sound goes wrong in spring. The pack swallows it, so eyes and fingers take the lead. Gloves press and feel water, not air, in the old weak layers. Once flow connects through the stack, the hill learns to move in slow motion. Timing becomes blunt and kind. Mornings are currency. Afternoons are bills due. Early crossings keep to shade and to ribs where nights refreeze stitch the surface into a single, polite cloth. South faces are used first, then put away when the sun climbs. North faces wait until the day grows older, then get a short, respectful hour before the thaw eats their patience too. A village that wasted dawn on gossip or errands that love evening was a village that learned to wade. Glide is spring's quiet mischief. Whole sheets of snow begin to slip on grass or rock, not because of wind or a fragile layer, but because meltwater makes a slick between ground and pack. Long, frowning cracks open above smooth slabs. They yawn wider at noon, pinch shy toward night. No pole hears that coming. Watchers mark glide cracks with wands a morning and write them on the slate with the same dull clarity they use for markets. Glide above long meadow, no afternoon below. Fence the footpath. Glide releases are untheatrical until they aren't. They let go as a shrugging mass and stop where the hill told them to stop last century. The cure is distance and a habit of going somewhere else when the crack says please. Roofs change dialect too. Guarded eaves that, in deep winter, broke slabs into useful chapters now gather a wet chapter and lay it gently down in a single paragraph. Lanes under eaves become short-lived rivers at noon. Runnels laid in January become important as gutters and are coaxed into water paths with broom, ash, and the heel of a boot. The village does a small choreography at breakfast. Sweep here before the drop. Lay a spruce bough there to keep a puddle from biting the packed path. Knock the icicle not because it's pretty, but because it will lie about where it intends to fall. Roads and streams swap jobs if you let them. So villagers do not let them. Ditches cut last autumn get their spring cleaning early. Ice chisels open mouths. Shovel blades pull away slush that wants to make a dam. Straw snakes are laid at corners to persuade murky water to settle grit before it finds a culvert. Where a winter berm turns to mush, a plank with bent nails across its ends is set as a temporary bridge for hooves. The catchment bowl, proud of its winter work, becomes a shallow pond and then, after an evening's careful cut, offers its water to the brook rather than to the square. Travel etiquette simplifies to thrift. Skis come out at dawn for crust, then go to the wall by 10. Snowshoes carry errands that must happen at noon, spreading weight over slush with a grandmother's patience. Sleds rest, not because they cannot slide, but because stopping them on a wet slope asks for more theatre than spring deserves. Footfalls step wide in fans where afternoon sloughs have written their fans already. Everyone reads rollerballs on the slope above like a clock with no numbers. They started at 9 today. Be home by 11. Forests keep earning their keep. Evergreen skirts, heavy with wet snow, comb the hill's first loose slides into surrender. Alder hedges along gullies catch the small stuff before it gathers self-esteem. Paths inside belts feel like hallways, cool, damp, obedient to boots. Where spruce gave way to beech on warmer aspects, roots grip thawing skins and keep runnels from taking the shortcut through a cart track. A belt that did its winter duty without applause now becomes a shaded aqueduct, teaching melt how to behave. Spring also reveals bad habits. The straight shortcut across a fan that seemed harmless in January now channels water through a yard. A fence cleared too clean of brush becomes a flute for melt to sing in, then to cut. A terrace wall knocked loose by a careless cart in autumn fails at the hour a roof sheds wet snow. The village fixes these as it fixes shelves. No speeches, 3 shovels, 1 basket of stone, a child with a broom, a line on the slate, lower wall reset. Path curves again. Livestock learn a new grammar. Cows leave the south bench for the shade by mid-morning and step like dignitaries across wet fans. Sheep are kept off gullies that remember to be rivers at 2 o'clock. Horses keep their cleats in the shed and their patience on the rib. Dogs, who spent winter reading the pack's brittle moods, now lie in doorways until the world goes back to edges. Goats, inveterate critics of fencing, meet willow hurdles sooner than they wished and are told that thaws belong to trees. Control work changes costume. Charges and cornice cuts become rare. Closures become late starts and early finishes. The horn says go now at 8 and go home at 11. Barriers swing across the gallery road at lunch, not because a slab will leap, but because a wet loaf might decide to stroll. Rail sheds chatter with small slides and warmth. Crews clear them in the blue hour when everything has remembered to be firm. Nets rest. Wedges matter less than runnels. The catchment bowls pole gets a new ring, full of water, empty by dusk. Rescue changes, too, when it is needed at all. No probe line fights with concrete debris. Instead, a shovel gently peels heavy snow from a cow lane. A door is lifted off its hinges to be a stretcher over slush. A boy with a pole prods holes in a white bridge over a brook so nobody learns foot first that spring built a tunnel there. The bell rings rarely and softly. The slate takes up gardening next to glide warnings. Turn the ditch toward onions. Clear the culvert by martyrs. Glides still open above long meadow. Teaching happens in wet footprints. A schoolmaster walks children to a slope at 9, 10, and noon. They watch it change from crust to sugar and draw what they see. Rollerballs, fans, little tears under rocks. They kneel at a glide crack and listen to the slow drip inside the hill, then back away to where the wand says ground. They cut a small notch at the edge of the catchment with a spade and watch water choose the brook. They write the sentence that every Alpine child knows before their first summer: water is a friend if you make it a path. The village's calendar shifts with quiet speed. Bread day happens early and often. Mornings are short, appetites long. Roof work moves to dawn. Fence mending to afternoon shade. Markets pack lighter. Jars ride in baskets, not on sleds. Letters cross passes at first light or wait until night's lock returns. Steps are counted less in 10s and more in hours. Home by the time the bell says 9. Indoors when the chapel shadow leaves the well. By late spring, heavy wet slides have done their blunt gardening, scraped old grass, rearranged last year's stones, left pale paths where summer flowers will come rude and cheerful. Meltwater runs in ditches you can trust. The catchment gleams shallow at noon, dark and empty at evening. The village sheds the last of its winter grammar. Bells go back to Sundays, the horn to shepherds, the slate to fairs and hay. People stand in doorways in shirt sleeves and say the sentence winter taught them: we used the morning. We gave the afternoon to water. If a visitor asks why everyone looks so purposeful at dawn and so unconcerned at noon, an elder will point to the rollerballs, the glide wand, the tidy ditch, the dry plank by the eave, and say, because spring is honest if you go first. Melt is not a foe. It's a moving day. You label the boxes, you clear the hallway, you lift with your legs, and you don't carry a wardrobe at lunchtime. A village that lives under loaded slopes cannot afford to start from scratch each winter. Its best tool is not only a shovel or a horn. It is memory with handles, pages you can point to, marks you can walk to, habits that outlive the people who invented them. In Alpine valleys, this memory took many shapes. Parish slates scribbled before fingers froze. Thick ledgers with rice stains and slope notes in the margins. Carved posts at path junctions. Little wayside chapels holding both prayers and maps. Stories told dull on purpose so they would be believed. Together they made the mountain familiar, which is the opposite of harmless, but close enough for survival. The ledger lived by the stove, where ink behaved and talk gathered. It didn't wear grand headings. It carried the household economy and the valley's geology side by side. Cheese to hands, 3 wheels fraternized with upper belt, replace forelarch, beach trial above rib. A page for November might carry nets tightened at notch. Wedge regrassed, gallery drip trimmed, then a line in the same hand about will cards and a note to remind the schoolmaster to mend the shutter before the first real wind. When a slide came and went, the margin took the facts without drama. 2A went at 9:10. Crown 1 man. Run short. Bowl half. A boy reading the ledger learned how rye and snow share a world. Slates hung where people actually paused, in front of the chapel. On the cheese shed, by the well, and used 3 columns because 3 was as many as cold fingers liked. Above. Between. Below. The syntax was present tense and neighbourly. Cornice fat at older notch. Windward path only. Roof shed likely afternoon. Sweep lanes first. Catchment bowl near full. Avoid meadow in thaw. Names sometimes followed the line. Marta, Capel, the schoolmaster's initial, because responsibility multiplied attention instead of diluting it. In spring, the chalk turned to water talk and garden errands without changing tone. A village that wrote simply could change subjects easily. Markers on the land made memory visible when white erased edges. Willow wands planted along a ridge in autumn stood back up through winter pride and said, here, not there. A post cut with 3 notches at a fan's rim whispered old run-out height to any eye walking the line. A tiny can at a rib notch remembered the day the sled route moved inland after a whumph and never moved back. Chapel walls carried a faint pencil diagram of the valley drawn by a patient hand. Ridges and ribs, gullies, and belts. A little cross at the older notch and a comb of lines where the protection forest had been stitched. Children traced it with mittened fingers while boots dripped on the mat. Saints and stories did part of the filing. A wayside shrine at the foot of a path was less about miracles than about memory. A painted panel might show a slide poised above roofs and a figure holding a shepherd's crook, along with the year and the note forest planted after. Names clung to places that needed manners. The sigh, a shallow bowl that loved noon. The sleeve, a gully that clasped and let go. Old shoulders, 2 larches that bent and stood back up. To an outsider, the names were quaint. To locals, they were instructions. The way a spoon's place in a drawer tells you where to reach without looking. Custom and law married quietly to keep memory enforceable. Protection belts were commons with rules. Goats kept out by habit, then by fine when habit slipped. Cutting above a belt needed permission. Planting below it needed none. House sites were rights in summer but opinions in winter. A parish line could say no building on fans and save a century's regret with a sentence. When a new family moved in and admired an open white meadow, the ledger could meet the smile with paper. Fan of the year of the geese, 2 men lost. No one argued. The kitchen found them a different plot on the rib. School did its part in the idiom of chores. Children learned to copy the valley plan each autumn, annotate it each winter, and redraw it each spring with wet paths added. They learned the bell codes like multiplication tables and the horn notes like vocabulary. They kept a snow book beside their copybook. Wind from south, rib friendly, lee rude. 3 nights clear, feathers on crust, wait for sun. Lessons were local, not because the world was small, but because danger is always local first. When those children went to the city as adults, they recognized other valleys, the urban ones. With eyes trained to read edges and habits, memory extended to tools. Ropes carried tiny knots at measured spans that a particular family used for long and short in whiteouts. Poles bore notches burned in for slope eyes, to finger drop, friendly. 3. Dawn only. The bell on the sled wore a leather tag marked with a winter, the year the river held early or late. The dog's collar had a brass disc stamped with the year it sat and saved an hour under a drift. These objects told their stories when talk failed, when fog thinned the world to one arm's length, or when a stranger borrowed kit and borrowed. With it, a family's cautiousness. Disputes were settled with maps the way fences settle arguments about goats. A gully wanted a right-of-way. A barn roof wanted to shed into a lane. A shortcut across a fan tempted strong legs and lazy minds. The village would walk to the chapel wall, deliberate in mittened silence, agree that the rib always wins, the lane curves, the shortcut retires, and someone chalked the new line on slate. If scolding was needed, it came in the grammar of chores. You will lay brush on the old track for 2 mornings and learn what we meant. There was also a ritual of forgetting, not ignorance, but mercy. After a fatal year, the ledger kept names and dates, but the chapel slate returned to ordinary sentences by the following week. The can stood. The one stayed. The rule about that fan acquired a gentle firmness. And the next winter, the story was told without color, as part of the instruction manual of the valley. Memory that is too bright burns. Alpine memory prefers lamplight. Legible, warm, precise dot on the far side of the calendar. Summer parades carried winter in their pockets. A procession to a high chapel visited the ridge where wands would stand in autumn. A hay day in the sleeve paused to point out the planted checkerboard. A market booth sold bells and rope with tags that listed lengths and winter uses. The schoolmaster's straw hat shaded the pencil map on the chapel wall while he mended its corners with paste. Visitors asked why a festival talked about avalanches. Because festivals remember who we are and what we owe the hill, someone would say. Then they poured wine and told a dull, useful story about the year of the drumming cornices. Modern tools joined the old ones without bullying them. A printed hazard map hung beside the pencil one, official stamps checking local names. A weather radio shared the shelf with the horn, its forecast translated into the valley's 3 words: watch, wait, go. A laminated checklist lived under a thumbtack by the barrier lever. Close road. Ring bell, chalk slate. Horn reply. Reopen after reading the bowl. The list had tiny food stains. That is how you know it worked. It was used by hands that were also cooking. By spring, the ledger's winter pages looked like a long conversation with no cliffhanger. Some years they were short, thin winter, rib easy, and some years they were crowded with small annotations, 2 belts mended. Glide at Long Meadow. Bowl full thrice. In June, a child pressed flowers between pages. That held notes about nets tightened and cornice. Cut. The soft petals kept company with the hard. Sentences until autumn if you asked an elder why so much writing for a place that can be read by eye. They might say, eyes change. Paper remembers. Then they'd point at the willow wand that saved 2 steps of a foolish boy. At the notch on the post that told a visitor where a fan ends. At the chalk that made a morning route turn left instead of proving pride. At the ledger that proved that a green wall of spruce outlives a generation when the goats are kept honest. Memory makes winter cheaper. It spends yesterday so that today can be dull and tomorrow can be ordinary. High passes were winter's narrowest sentences, short, steep, and full of places where the mountain could change its mind. Villagers at their feet learned to share the burden of keeping these sentences readable. Hospices on saddles, wayhouses on ribs, sheds along cuttings, little bothies in folds where wind forgot to look. The work was not to open the pass in the modern, heroic sense. It was to keep a thread, thin, honest, occasionally absent, ready for the errands that could not wait, a healer, a letter, a pilgrim too far along to turn back, a mule with medicine. Avalanche country accepts that most travel is postponed. Hospices exist for the exceptions. Placement was the first mercy. A hospice sat where wind trimmed the snow and where avalanches ran out of arguments, on a shoulder, not in a bowl. At the lee of a rock rib that broke a slope's long thought into tired fragments. Its doorway faced away from the shed line of the roof and away from the run-out of the gully. A wayhouse lower down took the same hints in miniature, a turn in the road where a deflection berm already asked slides to split. a stand of larch that combed spindrift, a little spring, walled in stone, that kept the well mouth legible even when paths forgot themselves. The buildings were not grand. Thick stone at the ground floor, wood above, a medium roof pitch that shed in polite chapters, snow guards lined like tidy teeth over the door lane, a bell hung low enough that a mitten could speak to it. Inside, benches along walls, hooks for ropes and bells, a shelf of candles, a table with ledgers and a pencil tied to a string. A pallet or three where a traveller could sleep shoulder to shoulder with the same stubbornness that kept them moving. A pot that seldom emptied. A ladle that tasted like onions, smoke, and patience. Dogs lived there sometimes, soft-eared, large-chested, better at finding heat than romance. They wore no fairy tale barrels. They wore names, and a habit of sleeping with one ear on the door. Hospice keepers were winter's innkeepers of caution. Their craft had checklists. Ring the bell in fog, 2 slow notes. Wait, 2 again. Stamp the steps, read the lee shoulder with a pole. Light the porch window at 4 on storm days even if no one is due. Chalk the board with the same grammar as the valley. Ridge good at dawn. Bowl sulks by noon. Return via spruce belt. They made small decisions feel official so that a stranger's pride could take instruction without losing face. They were economical with heroics and prodigal with oatmeal search, when needed, looked like housekeeping in long coats. A pair set out along the rib with short rope between, poles to test the lip and the hollow, a small horn for the return. Wayhouses along the line kept their own rituals. Lantern in the window if a party had passed. A rag on a post if the wind had erased signs. A pair of willow wands planted at the rollover where a summer path liked to lie to winter feet. No one searched the bowls during a storm because storms prefer to keep their work. They searched the ribs and the places where a person might have stopped to argue with weather and been out-argued. Signals stitched the pass to the valleys. Chapel bells spoke uphill. Horns answered down. A hospice slate coppered the valley's 3 columns, above, between, below, but between them meant between the saddles, lee slab on east shoulder after wind. Cornice long reach, stay windward. Galleries swept at 8, walk on drip side. The road steward at the winter barrier down below treated the hospice notes as if they were his own. Not yet. Now, be back by 10. Because timetables in Avalanche country are less about distance than about agreement, traffic had etiquette that made room for weather. Caravans broke into singles across a suspect traverse. Mules spaced like beads on a string. Loads were repacked at the wayhouse door. High bundles lowered, round things made square with rope. A traveller arrived and became a member of a temporary household. Hang your rope. Dry your mittens. Sweep your corner of floor. Add your line to the slate if you saw a wumph. Tie the bell quiet while you drink. The fare was plain and therefore kind to the stomachs of people who had been jerked around by wind for 3 hours. If you left in a lull, you left a note where others could read it in 3 breaths. Shelters had avalanche manners of their own. Door lintels wore scars where wet roof shed had slapped. A spruce bough lay ready to turn those slaps aside when thaw rehearsed spring. A runnel cut in packed snow escorted drips to a ditch. A plank with bent nails at the ends waited near the steps to be laid under hooves when ascent turned indifferent. A leather cap hung by a little rack that read, without letters, mind your skull under eaves. Everything was arranged so dull outcomes felt inevitable. In big weather, hospices became clocks. We'll wait until the horn at 1/2 If the wind still goes crosswise, we sleep here. A visitor learned that crosswise wind is the kind that stacks slabs and writes cornices quickly, while straight wind scours and, after it tires, leaves honest ground across the crest. The keeper would pour more of the stew that never ran out and point with a spoon at the chalk board. Watch wait. It is difficult to keep hurrying when a spoon points at wait. After a slide, wayhouses turned into tool sheds and kitchens. Probes leaned by the door. Shovels stood blade down. Rope lay coiled loose to keep from teaching itself knots. Volunteers ate first, then worked. A full stomach makes better decisions in cold math. The ledger took the day in unromantic sentences. Fans swept at 11. No travellers on list. Wedge held. Bowl half. When someone arrived from the far valley, stooped and full of apologies for being late, the keeper ladled without commentary and added a line to between 2 travellers in shelter, return at dawn. Trade and pilgrimage survived by being modest. Traders aimed for winter windows and spent a day mending harness rather than proving a point to wind. Pilgrims accepted that piety does not override physics and learned to give their devotions to shovels, bells, and spruce belts as well as to saints. The donation box at a hospice bought oats and straw and lamp wicks. In the ledger, it also paid for a new willow hurdle around a young protection belt below the pass. Charity and avalanche work are kin.in spring. Shelters changed tools. Cornice saws went to pegs. Spades for runnels came down. The porch broom, which had beaten snow from steps all winter, beat water off planks and scalded puddles toward the ditch. The bell rang less. The horn answered the valley with earlier go now and quicker go home. A patch of bare ground on the lee of the wall sprouted herbs for soup. A bench assumed the shape of old hips in sun. The building that had saved travellers by being dull became pleasant by the same means. Stories grew, of course, but they were told without the furniture of legend. The year man came over with a violin and played while the wind tried to lie to us. Good tone. Worse timing. The morning the cornice cut snowed us in, and we were grateful to be the ones under the roof and not under the lip. The dog who fetched a stranger's glove and, having delivered it, slept on it like a proprietary cat. These stories folded into rules. Ring the bell in fog. Never trust a balcony. Lay a spruce bough before the thaw speaks. Feed the dog first after a search. If a visitor asked why anyone kept a hospice when closures were common and spring would come anyway, the keeper might say, because exceptions arrive even in wise valleys. We keep a room prepared for exceptions. That is avalanche country's form of hospitality. Room at the shoulder. Stew on the stove, rope on a peg, a pencil tied to a string, and a sentence on a slate that says, in the village's old 3 words, watch, wait, go. Avalanche country eats and burns its way through winter on purpose. You can measure a valley's safety by the neatness of its cellars and woodpiles. When the mountain is in a mood, the best defense is to have no errands. So villagers stored calories and warmth at a scale that let them ignore a week of beautiful danger, drifts shining, cornices proud, lee pocket sulking, and stay home with soup. This wasn't hoarding. It was courtesy, paid to slopes with jars, cords, and measured stacks. Cellars were winter's lungs. Dug into moraine hummocks or under the cool side of a house, they breathed at a steady slow pace through vents the size of a mitten, screened against mice and stories. Stones remembered cold. Earth remembered moist. The two together kept potatoes from dreaming of spring and turnips from boasting. Shelves carried onions braided into mild chandeliers, apples sleeping under straw, jars of beans and beets labelled with a date and a hand that looked like the roof's pitch, practical, not pretty. Cheese sat like patient moons, turning when the ledger said, wiping when a spot fretted. Salt pork lived under its white winter, unaware of winds. In a good cellar, every shelf was a postponement, a trip the family did not need to make. The kitchen arranged its own truce with weather. Ovens lived where roofs did not scold. Their doors opened toward the side where lanes were brushed first. Bread days matched the slopes grammar, the big bake before a storm, so the village could be dull for 3 days. The small bake at dawn on crust mornings when a quick walk to a neighbour with a loaf and a note was safe. Soups were winter's diplomacy. A pot that started with bones, then turned to beans, then barley, then back to water had a week's patience in it, the way a good wedge has a decade's. Tea wasn't a ceremony. It was a tool, steam for fingers. A cup to put in a mittened hand before a question. Leaf sweepings from autumn herbs that remembered summer and asked nothing more dangerous than water. Wood piles were maps. You stack spruce and larch for quick hot work, beech and oak for long-staying coals. You kept the honest pine for the blue hour when a stiff wind asked for certainty at the stove. Stacks were shaped as carefully as fences, rode just beyond eaves shed lines, never against doors that might need to open while the roof told a paragraph all at once. A narrow catwalk of planks sat along the downwind side so boots could reach the back row when snow took offence at the front. Ash lived in its own wooden chest, scattered in lanes to tame glass, sprinkled under eaves to persuade water to choose the runnel. Save for the garden where onions prefer the world to be less sour, fuel, like bread, kept time with mountains. Wood was hauled in the early cold when crusts carried without complaint. Late thaws taught people to leave it where it lay and move only arms, not carts. Peat from a few wet meadows, cut and cured in summer, lived as bricks for storm days when a low blue burn was better than flame. Lantern oil was counted like horn notes. Every wick wore a trim and a check mark in the ledger beside it. When a storm stack arrived in the forecast, a clear night followed by wind and snow, keepers filled lamps, moved 2 baskets of wood indoors, laid matches where a sleepy hand could find them in the dark, and tied the bell quiet. Markets adjusted their appetites to match the mountains. In deep winter, Fairs traded dense food that forgave distance, cheese, smoked fish, tall jars of rich fat, bundles of dried pears like little brown bells. Perishables waited until spring. Wine waited for sled-friendly hours, its slush muffled by straw mats and a stern look. The village prized deliveries timed to go now mornings, and forgave long pauses when the slate said wait. Carters were merchants of safety as much as of goods. They bragged about reading a ridge, not about shaving a day. Fuel sheds and smokehouses wore avalanche manners like aprons. Doors faced the rib side, not the fan. Thresholds stood high. Roofs sloughed in chapters, guards set to keep midday tantrums from baptizing a stack. Smoke pipes learned to wear hats of angled stone so slabs couldn't slap them into folly. A drift seeking friendship with a wall found a runnel built last autumn, cut to a ditch that was waiting for exactly this conversation. If a shed needed a second exit, because wet snow once lay against the first, carpenters cut it waist high on the lee and fitted it with a simple bar a child could lift. Fuel knows patience. Doors must obey it. Communal reserves turned winter into a choir instead of solos. A parish granary held rye in wooden bins numbered like saints' days, opened sparingly when a bad freeze humbled gardens. A wood common stacked its cords in rings, each ring a family's share, taken only after the bell's 2 slow notes and the steward's chalk on the board. Take 1 ring if your pile is low. Take none if your pile is proud. Pride learned to look like generosity. A good winter reputation was the one with the smallest stories. Travel rations had avalanche etiquette. A letter over a pass carried more broth and bread than bravado. A small cheese, a slab of cured meat, a heel of crust, enough to sit and think if the ridge said not now. Water mattered more in cold than cities remember, a flask tucked inside the coat, not hung from the sled where it would become a bell of ice. In spring, a cloth to filter melts so bellies didn't learn humility later. A bit of sugar lived in the kit for after a scare. The body prefers sweet truth to salty heroics when it returns from a white room. Heat's engineering kept roofs from behaving like slopes. Attic stayed cool by design. Tight floors, polite vents, curtains over stairways to keep stoves from teaching snow to dream. Chimneys wore clean every fortnight. Soot is winter's mischief maker. Hearths kept 1 corner for drying mittens and socks without turning the room into humidity. A discipline as precise as ropes in a lee traverse. In some farmhouses, a tile stove held yesterday's heat and lent it to the new dawn. Tiles cooled slowly, steadying tempers and readjusting the day to match the mountains' go-early advice. Herbs and salt were the village's quiet infrastructure. Summertime and savory washed winter's pots with small courage. Pickles did what nets do, break a large monotony into bright, edible shards. Salt was gravity in grain form, binding, preserving, persuading. The salt chest was audited as seriously as the rope peg, because if you can keep food honest, you can let the weather be dramatic without joining it. Placement saves steps. Buckets lived near doors, not in far corners. Boots dried on a rack that could be carried to a neighbour's if a night's errand turned into a sleepover. The heavy kettle slept on the stovetop all winter, full, because a house with hot water is a house that takes care of its own ankles and other people's courage. The larder kept a storm shelf, 3 days' worth of dull, perfect meals reachable by a child's hand, porridge that forgives thinking about other things, bread, dried fruit, a good spoon. A note on the shelf read, in a hand like the ledger's, eat, sweep, wait for the horn. Fuel routes had timing like river crossings do. Carters took the high rib at dawn, where wind had shaved the pack thin. Return loads came home by the spruce belt when the sun began its persuasion. No one dragged a sled under a roof that had begun speaking in wet sentences. The bell's inspection peal often meant move. The wood now or move it next week. Firewood cutting stayed. Outside the protection belts until spring and then. Stepped gingerly into gaps chosen with the same checkboardy. Stubbornness that turned slabs into. Chores.in the bad years, reserves paid for humility. A family moved from the fan into a. Cousin's spare room softened the request with jars. From their shelf and the promise of days on barns in June. The common chest bought an extra stack of peat bricks for the widow whose woodpile miscalculated the thaw. The hospice stew stretched thin across a week when the pass said no. Nobody complained the stew was dull. Dullness is what keeps names out of ledger's sad lines. Children learn the pantry like they learned the ridge. They counted jars. They rotated onions. They refilled the ash chest and could tell you which ash was best for ice and which for soap. They fetched 2 hands of wood from the second row and knew what that meant. They learned that leaving a bucket full of water by the door at night is a sentence made of mercy if a neighbor knocks after a roof shed. They discovered, with secret pride, that a kitchen can make a storm day feel like a choice.by spring. The best cellars looked half-emptied in a satisfying way, not raids but scheduled departures. Wood piles went thin by plan, not by panic. The soup pot learned lighter songs, the oven baked early out of habit rather than need, and the pantry door stayed open without making the house feel poor. Melt filled ditches that were ready. The catchment bowl tutted twice, drained neatly, and grew busy with frogs. The mountain relaxed. So did menus that if a visitor asked why every house seemed arranged for siege while the lanes looked friendly and the bells sounded unexcited, an elder would point at the larder, the ash chest, the stack beyond the eave, the bread cooling at dawn, and say, because the less we need from a slope in a bad mood, the nicer we can be to it. Food and fuel are manners. Heat is a conversation. A full cellar and a neat pile are not romance. They are the grammar that lets a village tell winter, we will leave you alone today, and mean it.